Let us continue our examination of the question of whether liberal Asian studies has failed politically. Remember, this is a question, not an answer. We're looking for an answer. And the notion of liberal, or nowadays we might say woke, the influence of these ideas on how Westerners, professional Western students, academics, if you will, researchers, have misunderstood or underplayed or devalued the experience of Asians for a variety of reasons, none of which, in my view, is finally persuasive. Now, the rise of India and China, these two enormous countries, have fundamentally altered the balance of economic power and will, with political implications, defense implications, in fundamental ways. They are one of the most important developments of the 21st century. But these changes in an Asian context began with the Japanese miracle, the post-war rise of Japan, building on its pre-war experience, a major bone of contention. We'll return to this. But the Japanese were there first. And as the Japanese began to rise, and having been a student in Japan at the end of the 60s when this miracle began to take shape, institutionally, practically, numerically, because the Japanese growth numbers were extraordinary and mounted. Japanese economic growth improved steadily through the 70s and into the 80s. And this was the background for a reconsideration of Japan's place in world history. Now, to put it that way, the place in world history, this is a Hegelian viewpoint. And at the same time, we arrived at notions with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, with someone like Francis Fukuyama, who I interviewed at the time, and regarded with great interest. I followed his career, his remarkable career, for a long time. But his notion of the end of history is an Hegelian idea. What it means is not that the day-to-day bric-a-brac of events stops. That isn't what's ending. What ends is a period of world history governed by certain assumptions, certain factual truths, and then there's a corner. You go around a corner and things change. And with the fall of communism as a competitor to Western capitalism, Francis Fukuyama concluded that the end of history had arrived, that there was only one way forward, liberal democracy and free market economics. So, in this context, the question arises, did Japan challenge both of those assumptions? It wasn't quite the liberal democracy that we think of prevailing until recently in, say, Britain or the United States or Canada, Australia. And at the same time, it didn't seem to follow the rules set out by Adam Smith or David Ricardo and their successors, able successors, in another way. It was more German. It was Friedrich List. It was a different way of doing economics. And of course, China, India is a more complex picture, but China has followed its own path. China is a very successful capitalist society ruled by a communist party. Now, these are realities. Now, to refuse to look at these realities or to acknowledge the achievements of these societies out of an ideological or moral lens, or for that matter, an Anglo-American economic lens, really will not do. So I was among the earliest of students of Japan, not to seize on the facts of what the Japanese achieved, but to place them in the largest possible context. And so I arrived at my first book as an academic, which was Japan Beyond the End of History. In what sense did Japan challenge the notions that history had turned a corner in the way that Fukuyama had described? In other words, liberal democracy on the one hand, free market economics on the other. And if the Japanese contradicted these either or both in any significant way and was successful, then the notion that Francis Fukuyama had posed became challengeable, became discussable. We could argue about it in a useful, productive sort of way. So when I did the book, and just to highlight what I meant by the transformation of our intellectual horizon by Japan's achievement, I quoted a French novel, Asiade by Pierre Loti, which says, in the East, anything is possible. And anything. End of history or no end of history. And I went on to the book, which I will discuss in subsequent podcasts, about the way I set out my argument. But that's not the point. The point here is to say that my colleagues were very, very unhappy with this. And on the moral side, on the Kantian side, the ethical side, there could be no praise for Japan, because Japan was not a true liberal democracy. And even more irritating to my colleagues, or my left-wing liberal colleagues, was the fact that the roots of the Japanese miracle, people like Chalmers Johnson traced it, that these were pre-war evolutions. I mean, it wasn't just the fact that, for example, as a Japanese writer has written, that the ruling LDP, post-war LDP party in Japan had links to Manchuria and the Japanese colonial experiment there, pre-war, but also that the institutional arrangements, the bureaucratic framework, and the thinking that governed the Japanese miracle were pre-war. And the pre-war, of course, was taboo. The Japan, wartime Japan and pre-war Japan was bad, and post-war Japan, because it was liberal democracy, was good, and there could be no questioning of this dichotomy. And I thought, but I mean, and it goes back to my business. Probably I quote too often about my little story about the Titanic. And my story of the Titanic is two women are on the Titanic, and one of them is Welsh and one of them is English. And the English woman is a crusty, middle-class type. And the Welsh woman spots the iceberg and turns to her English companion and says, tells her. And the English woman so typically says, oh, don't be so negative. And the Welsh woman responds, I'm not telling you how I feel about it. I'm just telling you the iceberg is there. And my point to my colleagues was not whether I, was this, that, or the other thing about the Japanese. I'm just telling you, first of all, the growth was happening, and this had significance, intellectual significance for how we regarded the world. And there was no getting around this. And my colleagues wouldn't have it. They closed their eyes. Now, on the economic side, there was a similar parallel problem with the Anglo-American economics. People were saying, oh, the Japanese model mustn't work, can't work, shouldn't work, doesn't work, or something. And thinking, well, actually it does work, but it's different. And they wouldn't accept the notion of different paths to capitalism, different forms of modernity. There was a rejection of any kind of pluralism here, Machiavellian or any other kind. And you're thinking, please, look at it. And let's begin to make an effort, even if you didn't agree with me, to attempt to silence me, to cancel me. And that was the impulse. Either to attack me publicly, refuse to review my books, or if review them resolutely with hostility, this moral superior skepticism. Oh, how can the Japanese be good? Well, come on, let's look at the situation as it really is, and this Welsh realism carried me through this when my colleagues across the border in England would not have this. And in the States, it was very so much similar. You talked about Japanese success, and they would either glower or fado, sort of. And so this is this notion that you could do Japanese studies in this way suggested to me that you can't do Japanese studies in this way, and therefore, in some sense, it's legitimate to ask whether liberal Asian studies failed politically because it couldn't deal with the facts of political life of the Japanese miracle. Now, that's where we begin, with the realities on the ground in Asia, one, and secondly, the way we frame these facts, these trends, and that framework, that ideological, historical, interpretive, philosophical framework, or frameworks, if you will, is what Asian studies has to have as part of its armature. And the notion that cancel culture can apply to these things, so it will simply refuse to deal with this and not permit anyone else to deal with it, I don't think will fly. And that's where we'll begin on this journey to come with a considered, sensible, rational, factual-based argument about whether liberal or woke East Asian studies has failed politically. Because note, I'm not saying it hasn't failed in other ways. I'm saying just politically. That's the question. Now, that's the journey. And it's going to be rocky. Stay tuned.